I'm happy to talk about my work, but I would be more interested, please, if you would ask me questions. And let's talk about what it is you want to know, what it is about writing you might be interested in, and what I might be able to contribute to your understanding of how writing works. So perhaps you would begin, we could have a discussion, and then maybe people from the audience could ask me questions.
Ok. Você conheceu agora essa região onde tem essa UPP, né? Unidade de Polícia Pacificadora aqui dos Prazeres, uma das vistas, aliás, mais bonitas do Rio de Janeiro. Aqui no Buda do Subúrbio, já no primeiro parágrafo, você descreve uma situação de um garoto no subúrbio de Londres, numa das cidades que seria aqui para o Rio de Janeiro, ou uma Nova Iguaçu, por exemplo. E aqui você fala de uma mudança da sua vida. E você diz, eu tinha 17 anos. Como era o local onde você morava? Qual a situação? Como eram as pessoas quando você tinha 17 anos?
When I was 17 years old, it was the 1960s. My father was an immigrant. He'd come from India to make a new life in Britain. He married my mother, who is an English woman. The area of South London in which I grew up, for a long time I was the only immigrant kid there. It was pretty rough down there then. It was violent. There was a lot of racism. And I guess I was a very isolated child. I had friends, but also many of my friends had become fascists as well. They were called in England skinheads, and they had short hair and they had boots, and they chased around people like me and particularly my father. So it was quite an intimidating and frightening experience growing up, quite alienated in a country in which my father was a stranger. But my father was interested in writing, and he wanted to be a writer, and he encouraged me to write. So when I was 14 years old, I started to write novels. And I started to write because I guess I didn't really know who I was or what I was doing in Britain. So I wrote in order to find out, or to make a story for myself. And when I began to make a story for myself, I began to understand that there had been a relation between India and Britain, that we were being colonized by England for 200 years, and then we came to England to make a life. In order for me to understand this process and this story, I began to write my own novels. When I began to write, there were very few writers of color who were African or West Indian or Indian or Pakistani, and I guess I was one of the first. So it was both a terrible time for me and a very good opportunity for me to begin to speak about my experiences and my life in the New Britain that was emerging at that time in the 1960s and through the 1970s. And the novel that he refers to, The Buddha of Suburbia, was my first novel. And I guess in some sense it's my story and my struggle to try and understand the society in which I lived. And I think making words for experiences is a very liberating way in which you might begin to find yourself, to understand who you are, and to see who you are in relation to other people. That a story is something that you tell yourself originally, and then if you're lucky, you can pass your story on to other people, and they will begin to see you and understand you. And in that process of communication, you finally feel that your inner life is meeting the inner lives of other people. And I guess that is what writing is for.
I've read that you've began your career as a pornography writer. Is it true?
When I left university, I began to make a living as a writer. I originally got work writing pornographic stories for magazines. So yes, for a couple of years, I made a small living writing very crude stories that accompanied very dirty pictures. I'm glad that you brought this up. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me of, of this highlight of my...
So that's the question. Do you
my-
consider this kind of literature a low type of literature, pornography or erotic novels? Do you consider this is a low literature or there's a high literature? Why did you stop?
It's a very low literature, and it's a very crude form of writing. It's like writing, you know, a dirty joke. And once you've written a few of these stories, you realize that they are all the same. After all, if you're describing a copulation, it's a very limited form. There are only so many positions that you can get your characters into. So after a couple of years of doing this, I decided I want to become a serious writer. So I began to work for the theater, and then I began to write movies, and then I began to write proper novels. But it's absolutely true, I confess to you, and I apologize for the fact that I used to be a very, very dirty man. Watching movies is you know, incredibly enjoyable experience, but I think reading a book is a different kind of experience, is a kind of intimacy with a particular author and with the author's mind. But, you know, whether it's a movie, whether it's a play, whether it's a novel, whether it's a short story, in the end, what we are doing is transforming our experience into stories that may mean something for other people. So it's the same thing. I write movies and I write novels, but I'm still getting a number of characters together and then thinking about sexuality, thinking about religion, thinking about society, thinking about love, thinking about illness, thinking about death. All these different issues and topics, whether it's in a movie, whether it's in a novel, we are still telling stories to each other in order that we can understand our lives and understand one another. So I would say in many ways, a movie and a novel, it's the same thing. It's a story by other means.
Quando você estava em Bromley, no subúrbio, aí você, em que idade você sai realmente? Você consegue atravessar essa primeira barreira, que é sair do subúrbio? Quer dizer, que a literatura te leva, não só a literatura, pelo que você falou, mas que as expressões artísticas te levam. Mas se você tem lembrança do momento em que alguém leu um texto seu e você se sentiu, de alguma forma, que realmente eu tomei a atitude certa, eu posso ser um escritor. Existe esse momento na sua vida? Que é uma mudança?
I remember going to work at a theatre in West London, a very famous theatre called the Royal Court Theatre. And there had been many very exciting writers, directors and actors who worked in this theatre. And I sent a play into them, and they invited me to go and see them. And that day, the man who ran the theatre, he gave me a pile of scripts to read. And he said, I want you to write a report on all these scripts. And also you can work in this theatre selling tickets. You can work backstage. You can, you know, just get involved in the life here. And he said, what I want you to do in the afternoons is come to rehearsals. And he said, we're doing a play by Samuel Beckett. And he opened the door, and I went into the theatre, and I stood at the back of the theatre, and on stage was Samuel Beckett, one of the greatest writers, I guess, who's ever lived. And Beckett was rehearsing with a very famous British actress called Billie Whitelaw. And as he rehearsed, and I heard his voice, I saw him standing there, thin like a knife, speaking in his wonderful Irish accent. I thought, this is it, this is where I want to be, this is the life for me. Now, at this moment, my life has changed. I am in the presence of a great writer, and he's talking to me, he's talking to the actors, and he's working. And I thought, suddenly at this moment, as you said, that my life was different, and this was my home, this is where I should be, this is where I feel comfortable. And I worked in the theatre for several years. And I began to write plays, and then later on I began to write movies. So it was really being with people who were professional. It was their life to write plays, it was their life to act, it was their life to direct plays. And it was the first time I'd been with people whose whole life was devoted to creativity. And I felt very comfortable there, and I felt finally that this was where my home really was.